Well, welcome back and welcome to session 5. And before I forget, thanks for inviting me into your group. Sandra and I have participated in small groups for over 30 years. At our churches, we have a saying. We say that circles are better than rows. And we really believe that. Now, if this is your first group experience, I hope it's been a great one. And I hope that participating in gatherings such as this one become part of the rhythm of your life. Your life will be better if you make that part of the rhythm. Now, back to Irresistible. Last time we were together, Jesus, through the parable of the Good Samaritan, redefined neighbor for everyone, really pretty much forever. And in doing so, he dropped yet another breadcrumb pointing to the new he would soon unleash for the world. And as we discovered earlier, on the night before his crucifixion, Jesus inaugurated a new covenant between God and the human race. And this new covenant was intended to replace the old one, the one between God and the nation of Israel, the one instituted by Moses at Mount Sinai. Now, while the two covenants were different in scope and had two different audiences, they did have one very important thing in common. They both had terms and conditions. All ancient covenants, just like all modern contracts, had terms and conditions. Just as the covenant between God and Israel included terms and conditions, commandments and requirements, Jesus' new covenant did as well. And as would be expected, Jesus laid out the terms and conditions of his new covenant on the same night as part of the same conversation where he announced the inauguration of his new covenant to begin with. And as you'll remember, the occasion was Passover. Here's how it went down. Judas had just slipped out to run an errand. Odd time for an errand. There was still food on his plate. When the door slammed, it signaled the first in a series of events that would culminate in a nightmare for everyone in the room. Whatever Jesus needed to say needed to be said now. And so he said, "My children, I will be with you only a little longer. You will look for me, just as I told the Jews, so I tell you now, where I am going, you cannot come." Now, at this point in the conversation, several of the boys, Peter in particular, never heard anything after that. Why was Jesus leaving? Where was Jesus going? Why couldn't they go along? Jesus, as you may know, was their security blanket. Wherever Jesus went, crowds followed. And where there were crowds, the temple henchmen were not welcome. So if Jesus went missing, odds were they would probably go missing as well. Jesus continued, "A new command I give you." Now, they needed a new command they didn't need any new commands. The 600 plus commands they already had kept them plenty busy. Besides, hadn't Jesus already reduced their entire list of commands to 2? You remember that? Love God and love your neighbor. So why a third and why now? Besides, what gave Jesus the right to add any commands at all? I mean, grouping and prioritizing commandments was one thing, but adding to them? Only God had the authority to create commands. Then again, only God had the authority to forgive sin, and only God had the power to give sight to the blind, and only God had the power to raise the dead. So, oh well. Anyway, as it turns out, Jesus wasn't actually adding a command to an existing list of commands. He was doing something far more radical than that. Listen to what he says next. "A new command I give you, love one another." Now that was new. Jesus claimed to be the gold, or really the platinum standard for love. Doing for others what one hoped others would do in return was so old covenant. Jesus instructed his followers to do unto one another as he had done unto them. In this moment, he raised the bar. This was a whole nother kind of love. This love was anchored in a person, which made it extraordinarily personal for the men seated around the table that night. You see, when we read or when we hear, "as I have loved you," what do we think about? We think about the cross. They didn't. They thought back over the previous 3 years. And perhaps each man in the room was transported back in time to a particular moment in time when Jesus had loved them particularly well. He could have called them out one by one. He could have said, "Matthew, remember the first time we met? You were despised by your community. You were an embarrassment to your family. But I invited you to follow me anyway. Matthew, I want you to extend that same kind of grace to everyone you meet for the rest of your life. Matthew, as I have loved you." He could have said, "Nathaniel, Do you remember the day that we met? Do you remember what you had just said about me? Can anything good come from Nazareth? I mean, you dissed my town, my family, my childhood friends. But Nathaniel, I invited you to follow me anyway. Now, I want you to extend that same kind of grace and forgiveness to everybody you meet for the rest of your life, as I have loved you. And then he could have called the entire group out. He could have said, hey guys, do you remember the afternoon that my blood-drinking, flesh-eating illustration offended everybody in the audience and confused the crowd? And do you remember that afternoon we started losing the crowd? Every single one of you guys was thinking about leaving me along with the crowd to fend for myself. And guys, I could have left you to fend for yourselves as well. You certainly deserved it, but I didn't. And I never brought it up again. I want you to do unto others as I have done, as I did for you. And for good measure, Jesus could have added this. He could have said, and gentlemen, if you think you've seen love, if you think you've seen me love, tighten your sandals. You haven't seen anything yet. Now, you'll remember from our last session, Jesus had summarized the entire Jewish law with 2 existing laws from the Old Covenant. Turns out that wasn't just genius. It was strategic, because just as the Old Covenant included laws for the nation to live by, so Jesus' new covenant would include instructions for his followers to live by as well. But his list wouldn't be engraved on stone tablets. It would be engraved in the hearts and the minds and the consciences of his followers. The rules and regulations associated with Jesus' new covenant could easily be committed to memory. Why? Because they weren't a they were an it. There was just one, the one commandment, which doesn't sound all that commanding, does it? Now, this should go without saying, but I don't really hear many people saying it, so I'll say it. The Old Covenant commands, in other words, the commands that are associated with the Old Covenant, were part of the Old Covenant. In other words, the end of the Old Covenant signaled the end of the rules and regulations associated with the Old Covenant. You see, Jesus didn't issue his new command as an additional commandment to the existing list of commands. Jesus issued his new command as a replacement for everything in that existing list, including, are you ready for this? Including the Big Ten. Just as his new covenant fulfilled and replaced the Old Covenant, Jesus' new commandment fulfills and replaces the Old Commandments. In other words, participants in the new covenant are not required to obey any of the commandments found in Moses' instructions to ancient Israel. Instead, participants in the new covenant are expected to obey the single command Jesus issued as part of his new covenant. Namely, as I have loved you, so you must love one another. But Jesus wasn't finished. In fact, the significance of what Jesus said next cannot be overstated. Here's the best way to understand what comes next. Just as circumcision was the distinguishing mark for a man included in the Old Covenant, so this new command, this one another brand of love, would be the mark of the man or woman who chose to participate in the new covenant. New command brand love was to serve as the unifying behavior for his new movement, the church. Jesus went on to say that this new command would serve as the governing ethic, the standard against which all behavior was to be measured for those who called him Lord. Here's what he said next. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. And again, his primary concern wasn't what they believed. His primary concern wasn't that they believed something. He insisted they do something. They were to love as he had loved. Now, the men gathered that night had some inkling as to what this might look like. But 3 days later, it became agonizingly clear. But Jesus' new command involved another subtle but striking shift in the order of things. Jesus didn't tether his new command to the anchor that all the other Jewish commands were traditionally tethered to. Love for God, fear of God, dedication to God. Jesus tethered his new command to himself. As I have loved you. In other words, this was Jesus' way of inserting himself into an equation that mere mortals have no business inserting themselves into. And woven into all this subtlety was the not so subtle shift from vertical to horizontal. The eye to the sky days were coming to an end. The litmus test for being a Jesus follower wasn't the ritualistic day of the week, festival driven, don't forget your goat worship of an invisible and sometimes distant God. Following Jesus wouldn't be about looking for ways to get closer to God who dwelled up there, out there, somewhere. Jesus followers would demonstrate their devotion to God by putting the person next to them in front of them. Jesus followers weren't expected to look up. They authenticated their devotion to God by looking around. But the shift didn't stop there. Because you see, conspicuously absent from Jesus' new command instructions was an overt reference to his divine right to require such allegiance and obedience to begin with. In what is arguably his most future-defining set of instructions, Jesus refused to play the God card. Even in his final, if you forget everything else, don't forget this moment, Jesus did not leverage his holiness or his personal righteousness or even his divinely granted moral authority. In other words, Jesus didn't say, for Pete's sake, I'm God's son, do as I command. Instead, Jesus leveraged his example, how he loved. Jesus' love for the men in the room, rather than his authority over the men in the room, is what he leveraged to instruct and inspire the men in that room. And on a personal note, Jesus' love for you, not his authority over you, is what he leverages to inspire you as well. The men in the room, they wouldn't see him seated in a position of authority on the right hand of the Father. No, they would see him hanging from a Roman cross at the right hand of a condemned criminal. It was his gory and gritty sacrifice, not an old covenant, keep your hands clean holiness, that compelled his disciples to eventually take up their own crosses and follow him. And that should stop us in our tracks. A few years later, it would certainly stop the Apostle Paul in his. Here's how he said it. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. This was the Apostle Paul's way of saying that Jesus never played the God card. Instead, well, I'll let Paul tell you. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant. Being made in human likeness and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death. But not just any death. A death no mere mortal would willingly subject themselves to. He writes, even death on a cross. Jesus did not leverage his equality with God to stir us to action. He leveraged his love. This represented a total departure from the old covenant. Jesus did not anchor his new command to his divine right as king. He anchored it to his sacrificial love. Why should his disciples obey his command to love? Because he loved them first. He loved them best. They were to do unto others as Jesus had already done and was about to do unto them. Hours later, Jesus staged a demonstration of love that took everybody's breath away, including his own. It took the disciples' excuses away as well, along with ours. Jesus leveraged his compelling love to compel his followers to love. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. You see, Jesus' new covenant commandment established the governing ethic for his new movement, the church. It was simple, it was all-encompassing, it was far less complicated than the current system, but it was actually far more demanding. One thing that most of us didn't know growing up is that the imperatives that we find scattered throughout the New Testament are simply applications of Jesus' new covenant command. The New Testament imperatives are simply examples of how to love the one another's that Jesus commanded us to love. Again, his way is far less complicated, but in the end, it is far more demanding. Now, if you remember, at the beginning of our previous session, I highlighted the subtle hypocrisy behind asking the question, is blank a sin? Is it okay if we do this? Is it okay if we do that? And if you'll remember, I actually confessed on your behalf that we are all tempted to snuggle up as close to sin as possible without actually sinning. So as we close this session, I want to suggest a different question, a better question, a question that introduces inescapable clarity to just about every moral, ethical, and relational decision you will bump up against during your lifetime. This question takes us to the heart of Jesus' new covenant command, the standard by which we are to evaluate our behavior, conversations, and attitudes. And here it is, the better question. What does love require of me? What does love require of me? This clarifying but honestly terrifying question should stand guard over our consciences. It should serve as a guidepost and signpost and compass as we navigate the complexities of our culture. It should inform how we date, parent, boss, manage, and coach. It should form a perimeter around what I say and do in my role as husband, pastor, and neighbor. This question gives voice to the new covenant on issues where our New Testament is silent. It fills the gaps with disquieting precision. It succeeds where concordances fail. It quashes the insipid justification of, but the Bible doesn't say anything about this, and the Bible doesn't say anything is wrong with that. It closes loopholes. It exposes our hypocrisy. It stands as judge and jury. It is so simple, but it is so inescapably demanding. There are many things the New Testament doesn't specifically or directly address. And honestly, that shouldn't surprise or even concern us. Why? Jesus' overarching ethic of love intersects with every imaginable scenario we will have to face in this lifetime. New covenant people don't begin or end with the question, what does the Bible say about? That is so old covenant. New covenant people begin with this better question. What does God's love for me require of me? What does love require of me? Remember, for the first 200 plus years, the church had no the Bible. In the beginning, participants in the new covenant took their cues from Jesus' new command. Everything flowed from and reflected that one overarching idea. Now, when teaching this content to our church or to church leaders, I often ask the audience to commit the following to memory. Here's what I ask them to memorize. When unsure of what to say or do, ask what love requires of you. When unsure of what to say or do, simply ask what love requires of you. Again, the commands scattered throughout our New Testament answer that question. The New Testament imperatives are simply examples of how to love others as God in Christ has loved us. New Testament imperatives aren't there for your benefit, though you may benefit by complying. New Testament instructions aren't there for God's benefit. He's fine. New Testament imperatives are there for the benefit of the one another's around us. They illustrate what love for others looks like. To say it another way, Peter, Paul, James, and John did not add to Jesus' new command. They simply applied it. While Jesus' new command obligates us to wrestle with this new and better question, it does something else as well. His new command provides us with a new answer to an old question. His new command forces us to upgrade our answer to the question, why? Why obey? Why forgive? Why tell the truth? Why be generous? Why do all those things we were told to do growing up? You see, under the old covenant, why was answered with an eye to the sky. Israel obeyed God to fulfill their part of the old covenant contract with God. They obeyed to be blessed. They obeyed to be protected and prospered. They obeyed to keep the nation invader free. Old Testament prophets writing in their old covenant context reiterated over and over and over again the old covenant why throughout their instructions to the nation. Obedience brought blessing. Disobedience would result in punishment, perhaps banishment. Israel obeyed for her own sake. Unfortunately, that's the nature and the force and the tone of a lot of modern preaching. One of the devastating consequences of our mix and match church culture is we invariably mix and match Old Covenant and New Covenant whys. It's devastating because Jesus' New Covenant came prepackaged with a new answer to the question, why? You see, with the inauguration of the New Covenant, why would no longer be associated with appeasing God or purging property. Jesus' followers aren't instructed to obey in order to gain something from God. Christians obey in light of the fact that we've already been given so much. To put it in an old covenant context, we don't honor our fathers and mothers so we can live long in the land that God has given us, as the old covenant promises. In fact, He hasn't given us any new covenant folks any land anyway. I suppose one could contextualize this promise to mean that kids would live long in their parents' basement, but that sounds more like a punishment than a reward. Anyway, the New Testament, the New Covenant answer to the question why is always this: that's what love requires of me because that's what's best for them. That's what love requires of me because that's what's best for them. The Old Covenant why centered on doing right by God. New Covenant obedience is always connected to a who, and often it's the who beside you. My Chinese friend, who I introduced you to in session 1, was so puzzled over why more people in America don't go to church. Perhaps the main reason is that in our mixing and matching of covenants, we've lost the purity and the power of Jesus' new covenant command to love as He loved. That changed the world once, and perhaps it could again. And perhaps it begins with us. So, what does love require of you? What does love require of you at home, at work, at school? What does love require of you in the community? There are no loopholes or workarounds in Jesus' new command brand of love. Again, it is far less complicated than what many of us grew up with, but in the end, it is far more demanding. So what does love require of you?